Revelation. We're in Revelation and chapter 16. Last time we were together, we talked about the first three vial or bowl judgments, each angel having a vial pouring out the wrath of God. If you remember, the throne room of heaven became silent for a time because God did not want to have worship taking place at the same time that these extreme judgments are happening. And now we find in Revelation chapter 17, let's go to verse 8. And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him, the sun, to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with a great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. Well, at this point in the tribulation period, we're towards the end, those who were going to take the mark of the beast, they did take the mark of the beast. And so what we find here, even though you would assume that when you see these kinds of judgments, why would you still curse the name of God? Well, they have no other option ahead of them at this point. The mark of the beast has been received. Their hearts are not going to soften towards salvation. Their minds will not open to their need for salvation. And so all they have left is to curse the one they think is causing their pain. Now, their pain is caused from their own choices. This is a judgment for the choices we, as a human race, have made. But, as is often the case, the one doing the wrong doesn't necessarily think of it that way, do they? How many times have you had to correct either a child or an adult? It's not that children are the only ones that do this. You have to correct someone, and you're the bad guy. You're the bad guy because how dare you call them out? And they think, well, first of all, I didn't do it. So they'll lie in their head. By the way, sometimes when people are lying to you, they're also lying to themselves. Not all liars actually are purposefully trying to manipulate you. There are some that literally believe they've convinced themselves at least part of the lies they are telling you. Enough of the lie they have believed themselves where they can say whatever is left and justify it to convince you of the part they already believe. So how dare you because I didn't do it? Or as often the case when I find with kids, I did it, but it wasn't that big of a deal. I hit my brother, but it didn't hurt him. And I look at my kids and I say, well, you can decide to put your hands on your sibling. You can't decide how much it hurts once you've done that. I remember when I was a kid, the same exact thing happened. My brothers put their hands on me, and I was crying. I'm probably 5 or 6 years old, and I remember my mom saying the same thing, and that might be why I say it to my kids. You can put your hands on him, but you can't decide how much it hurts. And my brother, I remember saying, well, it couldn't have hurt that much. I only hit him like this, and he was showing whatever it looked like. And so people are justifying what they do by saying it basically doesn't deserve the level of punishment you're giving me. What I did wasn't that big of a deal. First option, I didn't do it. Second option, it wasn't that big of a deal. Third option, okay, it was a big deal, but two wrongs don't make a right, right? You know, this whole, I messed up, but are you really helping me by punishing me? What good are you doing by correcting me? You're just teaching me to be even more cruel. Now they're trying to use philosophy, mind games on you. Even if they do own up, confess to what they do, they want basically to make you think you're the bad guy. Now we are in the realm of manipulation. Now the first two, I think justifying their actions to some degree isn't so much manipulation. They truly believe partly of what they're saying. The third option, they know what they've done, and they want you to feel bad about calling them out on it. Now, adults are really good at that. Kids are learning. It's funny how even who kids are learning can still accomplish the task. Interesting how many teachers, how many parents can still fall under the manipulation of a trainee figuring out how this works. By the time they're an adult, they have a lot of them have fine-tuned their skills. And if you even point out at all anything that might be against the correct choice or the Word of God, that might be an immoral option, they are going to make you walk away thinking you are the horrible person. Now, those who've done it a long time, they aren't usually soft about it the first time because they've learned the value of hit really hard the first time and they don't come back. And so a lot of people, especially adults, that you call out for this, they'll blow up. And you're like, wow, I've never It's not like I do this all the time. I've only called them out one time. I texted them and said, hey, I just wanted to say I'm a little confused because I told you could watch my child, but I thought we had an agreement. My kid can't watch anything PG-13 or over, only PG. And the mom calls. She doesn't text back and says, what's the problem? You don't trust me? I watched the movie first. Everything's okay. You're like, well, I get that. It's just we only watch PG-13. Well, what? Look, why don't you just never bring your kid back to my house again? You know what? Don't worry about it. Maybe my kids aren't good enough for your kids, right? And what's she trying to do? She's trying to make such a big deal out of it that you will never call her out ever again. Now, here's the scary part about these people. They are often actually willing to follow through. Like they are so bought into this idea that don't ever call me out, that if this doesn't work on you, what is this? Like if you ever call me out again, then I'm not going to have a connection with you. Our friendship is over. Our acquaintance is over. And that's the scary thing. A lot of them aren't bluffing. That mom in that scenario that said, well, maybe my kid's not good enough for you. You're like, oh, she's bluffing. No, actually, the next day at school, that girl's going to go to your daughter and say, I'm sorry, we can't be friends anymore. My mom said we can't be friends. The only way you're going to fix that is if you call that mom and apologize. And then after that, you're never calling her bluff ever again because you know it's not a bluff and you're never going to call her out. And she knows that and you know that. And she's won. You see, a lot of people aren't willing to make the changes that are healthy for relationships, which is why so many relationships are falling apart. Think about the ones in your life that have not succeeded. It wasn't because the person was human. They are human, but that isn't why it didn't succeed. It wasn't because necessarily they were a horrible person. I'm sure there's some of those in your life that they're just really toxic. But a lot of your standard relationships that didn't work out, they're just people who weren't willing to change. They weren't willing to adjust to the needs of that particular relationship. And not every relationship needs the same adjustments. Some need different things, some need more things, some need less things. But someone who's not willing to adjust at all is not going to have any good relationships and probably not very many at all. You see, healthy relationships aren't between two perfect people. Healthy relationships aren't necessarily even between two mature people. Healthy relationships can even be with children who are still maturing if the children are willing to adjust and make changes as they go. So why is it that the human condition doesn't want to change? Well, obviously the answer is pride, right? And that is the core problem with the human condition, pride. See, pride is the mindset that it's all about me. Humility is the mindset, I'm going to focus on you. And people who have this idea that it's all about me, first of all, are easily offended. Because when it's all about you, there's a lot to be hurt over. Second of all, they're very offensive because when it's all about them, they justify any method of attack to bring you down if it threatens them. So they're easily offended and they're very offensive. People that are just deep in pride. You might want to help someone like that. Maybe you have someone in your life who is that. I get it. I think that that is the Christian way. That is the Christian heart to want to help people. But people who make the world revolve around them aren't looking to be helped. And the only way to help someone like that is to correct them. And now we're back where we started. They don't want to be corrected, and they will call you out when you do. And now we're back in the Old Testament where the Bible says, don't cast your pearl before swine. What is that? That's literally actually talking about don't bother giving wisdom or correction, wise counsel, wise correction to a swine who isn't going to do anything but roll in the mud with it. I think that sometimes the best thing you can do for people is show them the consequences of their choices. And if that doesn't help that person, then all you can embrace is this idea. If I'm not helping this person, the consequences of their choices will help the ones watching. You see, there's a lot of choices I make as a leader, as a principal, as a teacher, that I know my choices are not going to change that student. That student is not, I still hope they will change someday, but I know that this particular choice right here isn't going to fix the student. This detention isn't going to make them course correct. But you know what it does? It makes the other 17 students course correct. I'm not saying you correct someone for the sake of all the 17 others, but that is something you need to keep in mind. When you're dealing with another person, people are watching. So let's go back to that story of the mom. When you say, I'm sorry it worked out that way, I wish it could be different, and, our daughters can still and should still be kind to each other whether or not they can go to each other's house. That's kind of how I'd hit into the conversation. I wouldn't be calling her back, texting her back. I wouldn't be apologizing for that. Those are my rules, and it's my child. I'm allowed to have those rules. And if her daughter came to my daughter and said, we can't be friends anymore, I would tell my daughter, well, you just always be kind to her at school. Do not ever gossip about her. Do not ever talk about her. And if anything ever changes, you be nice to her. But I don't know that I'd be pushing that relationship. Why? Because with that girl comes her mom. And I don't want that girl's mom in my girl's life. So I would be looking at it as I just saved my girl from a lot of trauma and issues down the road because she's going to grow up with that girl and her mom. But also, who's watching my decisions? My daughter. What did I just teach my daughter? I taught my daughter that there are certain principles that are worth standing on. Now, when I apologize and I correct that mom and then say, sorry for correcting that mom, who's watching? My daughter and her daughter. And now I'm saying that I have principles, but I don't really have principles. And so I don't always make decisions for the sake of the person that's being affected by them. A lot of times my decisions are being made for the sake of those watching from the sidelines. These individuals, they're not going to change. So what's the purpose here? God isn't judging the world at this point to change them. God is judging the world because they deserve it. You say, well, is anyone watching? And because the saved are saved, they're not going to become unsaved, and the unsaved aren't going to get saved at this point. Sure. But you know what's great about the Word of God? God is allowing us to watch it before it even happens. So we're still benefiting from this idea that God is going to judge the world, and we can watch what God will do and learn from it before it even takes place. Now, this idea of the power of the sun scorching men with fire, that's a pretty intense description. We're not just talking about a sunburn. We're talking about such a heavy, deep, third-degree sunburn, the kind of stuff I would imagine you would normally go to the hospital for, except I don't think there's going to be any hospitals open at this point. The kind that you definitely would want to put aloe vera on if there's any in existence. The kind of sunburn that you don't want to put on a shirt, and if you do, you want it to be very flowy and loose-fitting, because anything touching your skin stings with an intense pain. Except it says scorching men with fire. I wonder, is the UV rays, the sun rays, so intense they're actually going through the clothing? Now, I'm not saying setting them on fire. I don't think that's what it's saying. But there is possible that maybe in some supernatural way, or even whatever, that the rays are so strong that normal clothing isn't necessarily protecting the skin of the individuals. Is it possible their whole body is scorching? One massive sunburn. I don't know. It seems to me that if this particular judgment could be fixed by sunblock, a hat, and sunglasses, it's not much of a judgment, right? That's kind of what I think. It doesn't seem to fit here at the end of the tribulation if just putting on thicker clothing and wearing sunblock would take care of the problems. I personally think there's something else going on here, and I don't think that there's anything humanity can do to get around the pain that is coming from the scorching heat of the sun. But even if they are not getting sunburnt because they're in the shade or inside, we are talking extreme levels of heat in the area. Now, if I am correct that technology has taken a nosedive at this point, there's no AC. That alone is a pretty extreme judgment. That staying inside isn't necessarily better, is it? Because if there's no AC, staying inside isn't cooler. It's like an oven inside the house. And then if you do go outside, you got the sun's rays scorching down on your body. There's no escape. This is the fourth. Let's move on to the fifth vial judgment. Verse 10, the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and sores, and repented not of their deeds. So that tells us that the previous judgments did not end when the next one came. The sores they received from the earlier judgments didn't heal when the pain from the sun came. And the sores, and so you got skin diseases from the earlier vials, paired with extreme thirst, paired with sunburn, all happened at the same time, and now utter darkness. Except this utter darkness is not actually across the entire world. The Bible gives us some clarification and says it's on the seat of his kingdom. Whose? The Antichrist. So the Antichrist has a capital. I believe it's Jerusalem. In fact, I'm pretty confident it's Jerusalem. The Antichrist is going to dwell in Jerusalem, rule from Jerusalem, and what should be the holy city representing God has been kidnapped by the unholy Antichrist. And so when God said, we definitely know Jerusalem is going to be under darkness. It says his city, but it also says his kingdom. I don't know at that point how far that would stretch. It would make sense that he, the Antichrist, would have at least the entire nation, the land, the holy land of Israel as was given to the Jews. It would make sense that's the case. Maybe he has more. Maybe he has less by this point. Maybe some of his kingdom shrank. But whatever he has power over at this point, his kingdom, it's all under darkness. You say, Pastor Russ, isn't the whole world under his power? It doesn't seem so. Pretty soon we're going to find the armies of the world marching on Jerusalem to defeat Jerusalem and to defeat the Antichrist. So now in the 7th year, the Antichrist is losing his grip of authority over the world. And so a lot of the armies are probably either marching or preparing to march by this point. And I'll tell you why. These vile judgments cannot be lasting months. How can you go 6 to 12 months with what we've seen so far? The ocean and the fresh water alone, you can't be going 6 to 12 months. So although the first sets or series of judgments could have technically been spanning over months or a year plus, I don't think that's the case for the vial judgments. I think the vial judgments are probably likely to be spreading over weeks. So not only are we in the 7th year, I think we're towards the end of the 7th year, which means the armies are probably already marching to Jerusalem. And get this, they're marching with the sunburns. They're marching with the skin disease. They're marching without fresh water to come to this place to kill the Antichrist. They hate God, but they hate the enemy of God, the Antichrist. They just hate everyone at this point. They probably know they're going to die, but they want to go out fighting. For whatever reason, they think that might bring them some peace or satisfaction, vengeance being appeased. And so they're not willing to turn to God, but they're done turning to the Antichrist. So the armies are already marching to Jerusalem. His kingdom is probably already shrinking, but whatever he has left power over is under complete and utter darkness. Now, wouldn't you think that's actually a reprieve? I mean, it can't be utter darkness and sun scorching your skin at the same time. I mean, I guess there could if God allows some supernatural scenario to go on, but scientifically, you wouldn't be getting a sunburn in utter darkness, okay? So you would think it would be some kind of blessing that is utter darkness. Except we find that they are gnawing their tongues with pain. So they're not being relieved from the pain they already received from the sun and the skin disease. It's still on their body. They're just not getting, I guess you could say, worse sunburns. Well, what about the heat? Is the heat any better? Maybe. I would assume probably not. That just because there's a supernatural, it's not an eclipse, a supernatural darkness may protect you from a sunburn, but I don't think it's going to be cooler in that area. So it's still pretty hot. But then let's broaden our minds and consider the entire 7 years. What's been happening? Demons have been coming out of the ground and attacking people. By the way, we were never told that they necessarily stopped, that it's possible some of these demons are still roaming, that the demonic army is still out and about. But even if it did stop, let's just for a moment believe that the demonic army had a job, it was a time limit job, their job is done, now they're gone. Can you imagine the trauma left behind by those who survived? When the first demonic army didn't kill you, it caused extreme, excruciating pain on everyone who was unsaved, so everyone was traumatized by that. The second demonic army, it killed a major portion of the population. What kind of mental trauma do you have after that event? Consider the anxiety and mental trauma of the world population from COVID-19. That wasn't demonic. Think about demonic COVID-19. where a much higher portion of the population dies in excruciatingly painful ways. There's a lot of trauma. And there's no counselor sitting on a couch talking people through this trauma. You know what people are afraid of in the dark? They're not afraid of what's not in the dark. They're afraid of what is in the dark. That's what scares the mind. The monster under the bed. Except what do you tell a child? There's no monster under the bed. If you say that now, will anyone believe it? There's no such thing as monsters. There's no monster under the bed. This now is a mental judgment. There really, some might say that there's some kind of pain in the darkness. The Bible doesn't give us that. It does say gnawing their pain, but I think that's alluding to the pain they already have when the darkness came. Not that the darkness itself in some way, some Stephen King way, that the darkness has a mist that hurts you. The Bible doesn't tell us that. I think that this judgment is a judgment on the mind. Now, all they have left to do at this point is think. And as they think, what are they doing? Gnawing their tongues with pain. Mental pain, physical pain, emotional pain, spiritual pain. You know what I've noticed the older I'm getting? I don't know that I really paid attention to this. Looking back, I can see it's always been the case in my life. But I started to evaluate recently in my life. About 2 months ago, I noticed my anxiety levels rising at a certain part of the day. Can you guess what part? It was at night. Now, it wasn't just when it got dark. It was usually when I had calmed down for the day, I was done doing whatever I was doing, whether it was spending time with my family, eating dinner, reading a book, whatever. When I'm lying down in bed and there's nothing else to do but think, my anxiety levels were rising, like significantly enough for me to evaluate and say, wow, why? I would catch myself thinking about things at night that were very unrealistic. I'm not saying outside of the realm of possibility, but very improbable. Things that could happen in the ministry, to the Christian school, to our church, things that could take place, events that could take place. And I would wake up the next day with a completely different mindset. I'd come to the school and do my job, and I would be honestly, transparently, sincerely joyful. I love what I do. None of those anxieties, none of those extreme thoughts that I had at night follow, at least me, in my experience, they did not follow me into the day. And it was happening fairly regular, enough where I started thinking, why is it that I actually think of these scenarios as realistic possibilities at 10 p.m., but then by 10 a.m. the next day, they're not even in remotely the realm of possibility. And I began to realize that as my mind had nothing else to think about that was active and productive, as my body had nothing else to do active and productive, at least for me, my mind, for whatever reason, was going to worst-case scenarios. But when I was productive and active, when my mind was in reality, those worst-case scenarios were so far-fetched, it didn't cause me any level of anxiety during the day. And then I thought back as a child, and I realized, that kind of the same things were happening at night. It was when I was scared of the monster under the bed. During the day, I didn't think twice about going into my room, whether the lights were off or not. It didn't bother me at all. During the day, I knew there were no monsters. It was at night, as a kid, that I thought there were monsters. What am I telling you? I believe that our minds can kind of go from one reality to another. And when you dwell in one reality too long, there's a term for it, it's called crazy. Because one reality can't be real. They can't both be real, right? And when your mind's always in the one that's not real, you actually, literally start going crazy. There's a lot of words that could describe a lot of different types of, crazy, whether it's someone who's paranoia, or general paranoia, or whether it's someone who actually starts, talking to themselves and thinking they're hearing voices, all these things. When you start living in a reality that does not exist constantly, you're crazy. I think that a lot of people don't start off crazy. Now, I do believe, for whatever reason, chemical or otherwise, there are some who are what you call psychotic. And as someone who's psychotic is essentially someone who was without emotion, without remorse, without any sense of right or wrong, and literally could do horrible things with a straight face and feel no regret over it. They're psychotic. Now, a lot of mass murderers are psychotic. Some people, I believe, are born that way. It's a defect in the brain. I've done some reading on it, and it seems that there's something different about maybe the way their brain works or doesn't work, that they're psychotic. There's nothing you could have necessarily done to change their psychosis. What could have done, just because someone's psychotic doesn't feel something doesn't mean they're going to be cruel. It just means they have the ability to be cruel and not regret it. You could still reach that person by helping them reason through why not to do cruel things, and it can't be based off of a moral sense of right or wrong because they don't have one. So it'd have to be a different route. But I do believe there are some people who become psychotic. They're not born that way, but trauma, something happens to them, experiences that just mess up their brain. The way their brain thinks, the way it connects, the way it transfers information messes up, and they become psychotic. I believe that if you do not deal with the trauma in your life, then what I explained that I felt in the dark can last till 10 a.m. the next day and 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And it actually never exits. And now you're living in this realm that for most people, they only occasionally experience at night when their body starts to shut down. Can you imagine the mental anguish those who live in that 24/7? Can you imagine what it does to their minds? It's a scary thing. Now, there is a way out. There is help. Because as I told you, both realities can't be true. So the help is recognizing what is the reality and fighting, because it will be a fight, fighting to live in the reality that reflects truth versus letting your mind trick you and thinking the reality you are in is truth. But here we are in this vile judgment. I think that is what's going on. People, if they weren't already psychotic by now, are becoming psychotic. Can you imagine a city full of people who are psychotic? You don't go to your neighbor's house and ask for a cup of sugar at this point. You hide, and you remain very quiet, because if your neighbor hears you, they might come over, and they're not asking for a cup of sugar. This is an extremely scary, mentally scary time to live. When I was young, if you were to ask me, and I'm talking kid, I'm talking 20s. If you were to ask me, what is the worst judgment, the worst punishment, the worst experience, the physical or the mental, I probably would have said the physical. At that point in my life, I could, have all the imagination of what could be a torturous physical experience to go through. And I would have said, physical. There's so many physical things I don't want to go through, torturous disease or otherwise, I don't want to go through. At 40 years old, I do not believe that in the least. I believe the mental is way worse. That the body, it's interesting how strong the body can be to sustain itself against even extreme physical trauma, like the loss of a limb in a violent way. It's amazing what the body can come back from. Men and women who've lost limbs, serving the country or another reason, and they come back and often they're stronger. They're mentally stronger, physically stronger. Their other part of their body has made up for that loss of limb. And as much as I don't want to lose any limbs on my body, at 20-something, I was thinking, that's the worst thing that could ever happen to you. After counseling teenagers, after serving God's church, and after living with humanity for the last 40 years now, well, I guess literally the last 15 since I would have thought that, I no longer believe that. I believe that the mind is where the worst judgment takes place. And I'm not talking to God's judgment. I'm just talking about the curse of mankind, that the worst of that is in the mind. Now, obviously, we're outside the spiritual side, right? Because, of course, the heart is the worst. I'm talking about the part of us that we can suffer through. I believe between the physical and the mind, the worst is the mind. And that those who suffer through mental health, those are the ones that are really suffering. And you want to hear the really sad thing? At least up until recently, I think probably a majority of spiritual leaders, especially pastors, didn't even believe it existed. There was no help for Christians suffering mental health because pastors would say, pray more. Get some sleep. Well, just stop being depressed. It's easy. Just, flip the switch and stop being depressed. I knew a pastor. I've known many, but I know of one specifically who thought depression was a sin. And so his answer to anyone who said, I'm depressed, was ask for forgiveness and get over it. And isn't that a horrible thing? That for generations, the worst trauma that Christians have been feeling hasn't been the physical, it's been the mental, and they've been feeling it alone. Because the church didn't believe it existed. The church did not help. The church would actually ostracize. The church would belittle. The church would pretend it was a myth. What you're feeling is not real. How the church could believe that when so many in the church are feeling it, I do not know. I can only imagine that they weren't willing to say the quiet part out loud, that it must be real because I also suffer it. So you have a bunch of pretenders claiming they're not suffering because they don't want to be ostracized. And to make that claim strong, they ostracize the few courageous ones who admit they have a problem. Now, I said up until recently, I think that we are coming to a turning point. I think God's church is coming to a place where we do now recognize, at least my generation, 40s and younger, is recognizing. I can't speak for the ones, 50s and more. A lot of them are phasing out, retiring. My generation, I think, is coming to the realization, this is a real thing, it's a problem, and there needs to be help, and it cannot be just pray only. That is a help. It is not the only help. There is help. Offering it, providing it, being a support system to those who are hurting. I see the church. We haven't turned the corner. I do believe the church is turning the corner. I knew a pastor in a different state. This was about 15 years ago. I actually would go to, he's from Virginia, and I would go to pastor fellowships with the man. He was married, kids. He was probably in his early 50s. He's a very energetic man, did a lot in the church. He loved God dearly, loved the church dearly. I was not aware. I was only like 27. I went to the fellowships. We talked. I didn't get deep in his life. I did not know, though, the man was suffering with extreme depression. He never opened up that to me. Why would he, this 50 guy, open up a 27-year-old youth pastor at the time? I didn't know it. And I didn't know it until I heard the news that he had jumped off a bridge into a river and killed himself, committed suicide on purpose. This is a pastor, a husband, and a father. He knew that when he jumped off that bridge, he knew the pain he would cause his church and his family. He knew that. He knew it was wrong. But he did it anyways. Why? Come to find out later, some of the things started coming out. He had been in such extreme mental and emotional pain, he stopped caring. He didn't care what pain it would cause the church. And I'm not speaking ill of the man. I do believe the man's in heaven, and I believe that he loved God. He just got to a point where, unfortunately, he came from that generation where depression was a sin. And I don't think any of his friends 15 years ago who were 50 or older would have helped him. And I think he knew that. And he was so tired of losing that fight with no help that he ended it. And this is a pastor. Shame on us. When God is using it as one of the worst judgments in the tribulation period, shame on us for ignoring it. Shame on us for saying it does not exist. I believe that many Christians are ill-equipped to face the growing epidemic of mental health. But when you're not equipped, what do? You change. Remember me saying that about 30 minutes ago? Because in healthy relationships, what do? You change. The prideful refuse to change and destroy the relationships that are most important to them. The humble change. If you're not equipped, change and equip yourself. Read some books. Gather some information. Pray to God and say, God, you are the giver of all wisdom. What am I missing here? Why have I not seen this? Why do I not recognize it? And until the change takes place and until you're equipped to help them, you can do this. Stop claiming it's a myth. Stop ostracizing. Stop belittling. And to whatever level you are able to, love and support the individual. I am not saying support their bad choices. I'm saying support them as a person and love them until you are equipped to actually help them. But I'll tell you this, for someone who's suffering through it, you'll be shocked at how helpful your admission and recognition that it exists is to them. It's amazing how encouraging it is for someone going through it just to hear from a Christian, I get it. I've never been through it, but I believe it. I believe you're suffering, and I want to love you through it. That alone is a help to them. It's not going to probably help them to the point of success, but it is helpful. We can do better. This is a pretty big judgment. God is saving it to the end. This is the 5th of the final series of judgments, and God said, let's judge them with mental health. Extreme darkness, where all the time they can think about is there's monsters under the bed. Okay, Vial 6. 12, verse 12, and the 6th angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. I told you that the armies are marching, right? The river Euphrates is hindering the armies from getting to Jerusalem, from getting to the Antichrist. And so now God says, one of the judgments is going to be an open pathway for the armies of the world to march on the Antichrist. Basically, God says, the judgment is, I'm going to let you guys kill each other. Not much to say there, except I think that there are times where we look at God and say, God, why don't you fix the government systems? And God says, well, actually, it's part of my judgment to let the government systems do what they do. Humanity has turned their back on me, and I'm going to give them the king that they asked for. And I'm going to let that king do what that king does best. Sometimes I think God's judgments are to step back and to allow. He doesn't always necessarily need to be directly involved. All right, we're going to end here. We'll talk about the Battle of Armageddon next time we're together, which, of course, is the final battle. Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I guess we'll get to that because there's actually more chapters. Going to be looking at some chapter 17 and 18, talking about some more pictures. We will get to the Battle of Armageddon eventually, and we'll talk about where that was located and how big of a place that was. But looking at some pictures and the battle in heaven, I'm not sure if you know, but there are 3 battles in heaven between Satan and God. Were you aware of that? Well, let me rephrase that. 3 battles between Satan and God, and we're going to find that there is a battle coming up between Satan and Michael, the archangel, and this takes place in heaven. And we'll talk about that. We probably will get to that next time we're together. So we're going to go and close. If you're watching on